Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. My second guest this morning is, or this afternoon, or this evening, is Ashish Kothari, with whom I'd like to discuss radical pathways out of the global crisis. Ashish is a founder member of the Indian environmental group Kalpavik. I think I pronounced that right, taught at the Indian Institute of Public Administration, coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, and served on Greenpeace International and the India's board. He has been involved in many, many other things, and most recently published a most interesting book entitled Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, which he put together with Ariel Saleh, Arturo Escobar, Federico de Maria, and Alberto Acosta. Ashish, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for sparing
Thank
time
you.
to join us on the show. So,
Thank you.
give me an idea of what you see as the global crisis.
Well, I guess the one that's in front of everybody's mind these days is the COVID related one. But I think it's important to realize that with COVID, as much as it's a medical or health crisis for hundreds of thousands of people, even more than that, it's a livelihoods crisis for many, many more people where states are taking actions in response to COVID, actions like lockdowns and so on and so forth. I mean, in India, for instance, several 100 million people are affected by that in terms of the loss of economic livelihoods, the loss of the ability to sell their products or exchange their goods and so on and so forth, and especially with migrant labor. So, to me, the COVID crisis actually is also exposing to us the other global crises that we have already been in the midst of, including inequality and the kind of precarious conditions in which hundreds of millions of people are working. And this is partly a result of the kind of economic globalization that has taken place, which makes people highly dependent on the global economy. And when the global economy collapses for some reason or the other, like what has happened now or what happened in 2008, and what's likely to happen even more with the climate crisis hitting us, these are the people who are first affected, or people who don't manage to get food because their self-sufficiency has been radically damaged by ecological destruction, biodiversity loss, climate crisis, or displacement by so-called development projects. So I think it's this whole mix of global crises that we're talking about, much of which has also been continuing from the past and has been very blatantly exposed by what's happening right now.
Yeah, that's a point that many people who we've interviewed have made. That in a sense, what the COVID crisis has done, what the coronavirus has done, is lifted the veil in front of our eyes to become clearer about the nature of our societies. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I think the fault lines that have been kind of somewhat hidden in welfare societies and so on are being very clearly exposed. The fault lines of capitalism, for instance, between those who make all the profits and those who are being exploited as labor. The fault lines between human beings led by a certain capitalist statist masculinist society and the rest of nature. Um, and so I think, to me, the sort of fundamental structural faults in our system, um, of capital, of state-led domination, of patriarchy and masculinity and racism and so on, are all being horribly exposed right now.
So, so then the solution which most states across the world offer is one of washing hands using soap and what they call social distances, in fact, physical distancing. For the majority of the world's population who live in settlements, in slums, in intensely populated areas, all of these measures are almost ridiculous. Access to water in many societies is limited, and there is no possibility to have physical distancing. Um, so that's the situation. And so the policies that they are putting forward apply quite well to the protection of the elite and the middle classes, uh, but don't seem to offer anything out of that for them for the dispossessed. So what are the pathways out of this crisis?
Well, I think if you look at the responses from communities in many parts of the world, they're coming up with solutions of various kinds that I think we should be looking at and listening to, and states should especially be listening to. For instance, communities in many different parts of the world, including in India, in some places, have been able to figure out one, going back to some of their own traditions of distancing when they've had disease outbreaks. This is a very common phenomenon, for instance, for a lot of indigenous peoples, where they will isolate themselves and they know of ways to isolate themselves when there is a disease outbreak. Migratory pastoralists in Western India, for instance, are not going into the villages that they would normally go into because they know they've had a tradition or a past history of disease outbreaks, and they're dealing with that. Or fishing communities in the coastal areas are also trying to do this, even as they are going out fishing collectively. And when they're coming back, they're trying to figure out and have figured out ways on which by which to have distancing. I think
Abs-
what the lessons we're learning from some of these examples of the immediate responses that people are giving, or even sensitive governments are doing, is that even in situations where communities have to do collective work and have to live collectively, if they are truly empowered, and if their own knowledge systems can be built upon, one can find ways of which by which to do the kind of distancing that you need, even as social bonding actually increases. That's the crucial thing. Physical distancing, but social bonding. And who better to do it than closely knit community if that spirit still retains?
so give us some examples of where that is happening.
So, for instance, in rural India, in some parts of rural India, or in the coastal parts of India, communities have there are a number of things I've already mentioned. For instance, that they've figured out ways by which physical distancing can happen, even as they go collective fishing or they go into the forest for collecting their forest produce, etc. But when they are, and even as they're doing community meetings, when they're doing these community meetings, trying to figure out what exactly to be, how to behave in such a way that risk is minimized. But I think what's very important is, because of the fact that the greater impact is felt because of the loss of economic livelihoods and or state surveillance and authoritarian tendencies and so on, that the responses communities are giving. Let me give you a couple of examples. In South India, there is a network of women's groups in about 75 villages. And for the last 30 years, they have been reviving their traditional agriculture, going back to organic farming, local seed diversity, and so on and so forth, and achieved food security and sovereignty through that. In the current situation, they don't have a food problem, but they're gathering themselves while being physically safe to be able to deliver relief to those like municipality workers or health workers who need that, or landless people in the same villages who need that kind of food relief. Or if you take another example from central India, where a community has managed to take back its collective rights to the forest on which it depends, and they have been able to market some of those produce in the last few years. They're using the community funds generated from that to be able to help the those who don't have, who had to come back because their jobs are lost. Um, and one finds similar things. I mean, Italy, for instance, I read this wonderful story of African migrants who initially were found it very hard to actually establish an economic base there, have worked up a cooperative where they do farming. And right now, as part of the relief measures, they're actually working extra hard to produce more food on the land so that they can deliver relief to Italians not the migrants, but even the other Italians. So I think there's a huge number of examples of that kind where solidarity is coming up, where traditional knowledge is coming up, where community empowerment is becoming the crucial positive factor.
One of the things that has emerged out of interviews that we've done with others about the situation in India has been that for small farmers, the restriction on the lockdown means that they are not able to get their products to market. It's, I'm told, resulted in a much greater increase in suicides amongst these small farmers, much more than what was happening in the Green Revolution zones. And we also then have a restriction the amount of food that's available in the cities. And of course, you have cities, Mumbai, with densely populated areas and people without even homes. So what are the radical pathways out of this crisis?
So I think if we look at some of the responses that have been given by communities, and in some cases actually even by sensitive administration, what they've been able to do is to either continue or create much more localized food exchange systems. Farmers markets, for instance, in a decentralized manner rather than in one central big mall or something like that, where the farmers have the ability to be able to transfer the food because it's very short distance, and where the consumers are then able to directly also buy the food from the farmers. So farmers markets in many different places have managed to do that. And where there has been a relationship that has been built up because of the community mobilization between them and the administration, this becomes even easier because even during the lockdown, as we know, transportation of some essential goods had to happen. The crucial thing is how much distance do you have to take that those essential goods becomes very important. If the distance is very large, it becomes very difficult. If the distance is a few kilometers, it is much easier. And that's where, in fact, even where these localized, decentralized food markets, farmers markets did not exist, many have come up in this current crisis. So it seems to me that we're talking about a combination uh, collective food security and sovereignty, where the farmers have the control over seeds, over land, over water, over their knowledge, but they're also able to build a relationship with consumers who want healthy food, who actually want food in the middle of this crisis. And importantly, also, that it's not just wealthy consumers, not just the elite in cities who can afford that kind of thing, but also the poor. So amongst all the efforts is also a number of efforts where in this consumer producer relationship, um, there is an attempt to also make sure that those with poor income or lower income, and those who need the immediate relief, are able to get food.
But in a situation where large sections of the population in cities are not in a position to go to market, as it were, where food is limited access, as I understand it, and where whether by design or intention or not, one gets the impression, not just in India but across the world, especially in the global south, of a eugenicist action, that they don't care a shit about the impoverished, the wretched of the earth. Uh, I mean, that's a fundamental part of the crisis, and you say that the coronavirus has lifted the veil for us to become much more aware of that. So, what's the radical pathway out of that?
Well, I think there's four or five sorts of transformations that need to happen, and each of these one can see is actually practically already possible with thousands of initiatives around the world, given a chance. So I already mentioned, for instance, sovereignty of various kinds. So when you're talking about basic needs, food, water, energy, housing, etc., we need situation where people, communities are empowered way more than they are right now, both in villages and in cities, to be able to manage, govern and manage the resources that they need for being self-reliant on these, for these basic needs. So what that also then means is that the economy needs to be very fundamentally restructured, for the control or the ownership of producers over the means of production, for a much more localized system of exchange, and not the kind of mad economic globalization that has taken place, where I might be dependent for my basic need on something 3,000 kilometers away. And for the recovery of an economy in which caring and sharing, um, recognizing the role of women, for instance, the caring and sharing is as central a part as the actual economic or financial exchange. And again, this crisis has shown us the incredible importance of the invisible role that people play, especially women play, in caring, for instance, for the elderly. I mean, so many solidarity networks have come up spontaneously with people saying, okay, if the old cannot go out to shop because it's unsafe, we will do the shopping for you, and so forth. So that's the economic part of it. But that alone will be not sufficient unless we're also talking about radical political democracy, not a democracy in which we elect somebody and then for the next 5 years we kind of don't have any power, but where we actually assume and claim back the power that is inherent in us as local people, as citizens, as local communities. More radical, more direct democracy. And again, there are many examples of that around the world. And third, crucially, the struggles for social justice, because when we have gender inequalities and discrimination, or in India, casteism or racism in many parts of the world, that cannot go hand in hand with a just radical democracy or radical economy. It also needs the social struggles. And all of this based on respect for the rest of nature, because without the environment, we're all dead anyway in the long run. So that's what I call a radical ecological democracy, putting all these different elements together.
Some people would say that you've described the sort of radical goals that we would like, and I don't think many would disagree with it. The question is, how do we go from here to there? What are the pathways? So perhaps you could focus on or help us understand what you see as the pathways towards that. We don't have a democratic society. We don't have people able to take control of their own destinies. We don't have a society which has freed itself from patriarchy or indeed of capital. What are the pathways?
Yeah, so I think maybe I should start with saying I think what is not a pathway, which is unfortunately where a lot of movements have focused a lot, which is trying to capture the state. Leftist progressive parties capturing the state. I don't think that's been a solution in any part of the world. It helps in terms of more welfare and so on, or less exploitative conditions, but it doesn't really create the fundamental changes. I think the pathways lie in creating a much greater critical political mass amongst all these different radical initiatives that are there around the world. Much more networking, much more the ability to be able to survive the attacks coming from the dominant system, but also spread these initiatives of radical ecological democracy, along with the kind of movements of resistance that we have seen also around the world, whether it's the climate justice resistance, or it's Occupy, or it's attack, or so many around the world that have actually been inspirational in many different ways, or the resistance against mining, or the resistance against big dams, and so on. It's the ability to try and create the networks of these resistance and the constructive alternatives that could perhaps create the greater critical mass to make that change. Let's not forget, I think, because you mentioned that we still have patriarchy and so on. Of course we do. But let's not forget the fact that if women are in a better situation today than they were 100 years back or 200 years back, it's because some individual women stood up and said, enough is enough. I have an equal right and I will make my voice heard. And they felt the consequences. But because they did, more women did, more men got sensitized to it. And today we definitely have a situation where, whenever I go to students and talk to them, I say that if 50% of you are women in this school or in this college, we have to thank the fact that there was a movement of that kind that was led, even if it was one woman who actually stood up and said something. And I think, therefore, and today we have, just last point here, today we have a situation where probably never before in history have we seen our global connection so clearly. The fact that we are one Earth, that the fact that we are one humanity, the fact that something that an American does affects me here in India. It's very, very clear whether it's to do with climate or COVID or anything like that, and and the fact that we are part of nature. So let's use this maybe once in a lifetime opportunity of awareness amongst people, along with the grassroots mobilizations that have taken place, to see whether we can actually make that larger macro shift to happen over the next few decades.
Let me chase you a little bit more. I think a lot of people would say, yeah, all those are good intentions, but how do we get there? How do we organize in the time of COVID? Let's take a city like Pune, or we take Mumbai. We say, all right, this is the concrete situation which people face. How do we now take it from where we are towards a direction that we wanted to go?
So let me give you the example of a smaller town which might be able to give us clues on what has happened. So there's a town called Bhuj in Western India. It's 200,000 people, so it's not obviously nothing compared to Mumbai or New York or whatever. But what has happened here is that a significant level of creating of mobilization based on information of how citizens can and should be much more a part of the urban planning process and the urban budgeting process, and able to actually create self-reliance with things like water and energy and so on, and in other many other parts of the world, for instance, urban agriculture, to create more greater food self-reliance even in cities, has been able to show that we can actually have practical pathways by which the kind of radical ecological democracy I'm talking about is also possible. Now, you need to move from, let's say, 5 or 10 such colonies able to do something like that, or neighborhoods able to do that, to looking at the city as a whole and saying, okay, how does the city as a whole, what kind of restructuring, what kind of replanning do we need in order to make this much more possible? So it seems to me that this combination of the grassroots ability and then the pathways of policy shifts, and eventually then taking over the state in that sense, or moving the form of the state in many different ways, is what we need to do. I don't think this is going to happen in the next few years. I think it's a multi-generational process that we need to think about. But places where it has happened should show us the way by which more can happen. If you look at the transition movement, for instance, in some parts of Europe, where cities are trying to become much more carbon neutral, much more eco-friendly, and much more reclaiming the commons from the privatization that has taken place, it again shows us possibilities of the actual pathways, the practical pathways by which to make this happen.
I'm sure you must be aware of Arundhati Roy's recent essay about the portal. And she says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. It's quite clear that the Indian government understands that very clearly and has a very clear idea as to the new world it wants to create. And so how do we make sure that organizing takes place today? And let's go to the hard ones where you are dealing with intensely large cities like Mumbai. What are the pathways to beginning today a discussion about the kind of world we want to create?
Well, I think those discussions are already starting. They're not reaching enough people. We need to find ways to reach people, which is obviously physically right now very difficult. But given the fact that a lot of people are connected up digitally, including poor people through their phones and so on, I think we need the ability, the sort of creative communication to be able to get across to a much larger number of people, saying, look, here's one scenario, which is what the government is proposing, which is a much more authoritarian, much more state surveillance kind of scenario, saying, okay, we are the only ones who can save you from viruses or whatever else. And here's another scenario, of what people are trying to do with local mobilization, with local community health, with local relief work, etc., etc. Which would you prefer? And if there's a possibility of us meeting in some way, even virtually for the moment, and saying, okay, here's the inspiration that we can use for an alternative way of doing things, or alternative way of organizing Mumbai, for instance. And in fact, in all the big cities in Delhi, some of this is happening. Still very very little, but some of this is happening. Where people are not taking it lying down. They're not saying that okay, the government is the one that should be doing things, but saying no, we need to be able to self-organize. So I think we need that much more creative communications, much more creative way of mobilizing ourselves, even in the middle of a physical distancing situation. But very importantly, also to recognize that it's not just the immediate horizon, right? It's not just the next 2 months or 3 months. Right now, people are dealing with immediate issues, and that is important. But to say that we are going to get out of this, the question is in what direction do we get out of it? If we are in the middle of a storm, do we head blindly towards a iceberg, or do we kind of look at history and look at possibilities of where to head, which might be a much safer direction? That kind of communication, that kind of messaging, that kind of, even when schools reopen and colleges reopen, to be able to get across to young people, especially young people, I'm saying, is we need to do much more of that.
So
And
am
with
I
stories of
hearing?
inspiration, stories of hope. I mean, that's because people respond to that. They respond to stories. They don't respond only to dry concepts and abstract things and so on and so forth. And that's where, unfortunately, the regressive forces in society have been much better. They have been able to reach people's heart and not just the minds, whereas people like us have only sort of spoken intellectually. So we also need to get across through the heart, and we need to do a much better job.
Yeah. This morning we spoke to Kavita Krishnan, and she was pointing out about the horrendous attacks that are happening. There's growth of Islamophobia. There's a lot of phobia about people who are presumed to have COVID. So there is, people are being massacred on the street. That is the reality that is faced. So the question, let me ask you again, how do we get to deal with that? How do we create the alternatives? Because if they continue, the world that they create is not one that is going to give us much hope.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think in India, fortunately, we still have a strong civil society, and that's the one that's continuing to expose the kind of stuff that the state and the various institutions and organizations that are part of creating, whether it's Islamophobia or it's so many other things, of continuing to expose them. And we still at least have some element of an independent media that is able to carry those stories and show how what's happening. So that's the resistance part that I was talking about earlier, that we need to continue doing that to speak truth to power and so on. And I think at least in India, we still have the ability to do that, which is unfortunately much less in many other countries. But along with that, also to say that if this is not the way to go, what is the way to go? So, if, for instance, we have a law which discriminates against Muslims in terms of refugees and people who come in here who need citizenship, what's the alternative legal way, or the alternative other way by which, in fact, refugees can be welcomed and can become full citizens of India? It's this kind of thing that we need, this dual packaging to do that. Will we be able to survive the onslaught of the state using COVID as an excuse? I don't know. But unless we fight and keep up our hope and resist and show stories of inspiration, I think we would have lost the battle much before it otherwise needs to be lost. So that to me, and very importantly, if you go to the most oppressed sections of society, um, any of the oppressed sections of society, and you speak to them, I think, of course, there's despair and of course there's suffering and so on, but there's also the ability to keep smiling and to keep saying that no, we will overcome this. And if that is the case with those who are the most disprivileged, then for somebody like me and you, I think it becomes our responsibility to also keep smiling, hoping, and supporting these sorts of grassroots struggles.
Yeah, as I think it was Eduardo Galeano who says that what we must do is shelter hope. And And that's clearly a key message that we have to hold on to. Any last messages that you would like to convey to those who are watching the show?
I think, I mean, I would like to say that I've been in this now for 40 years and gone through all the ups and downs and all the despairs and the sort of loss of hope and all of that. Uh, to me, I think it's very, very important what I just said a couple of minutes back, that it's the struggles on the ground, it's the struggles of the most disprivileged, the most marginalized, that have provided me continuous hope. And I think all of us who have even a little bit of concern of what we are going through and what the earth is going through, we need to put ourselves in the front line, supporting these grassroots struggles, being part of them, speaking out. And I'm talking here not just of disprivileged humans, but also all other species on earth that are so badly hit by us. Uh, is to be able to continue to, as I said earlier, speak truth to power, however bad the situation might be. So that would be my hope, that I think uh, everybody who's listening into this is hopefully already doing this, and if not, we must do that in whatever small way that we can.
Great. Ashish Kosari, thank you very much for joining us here on Organizing at the Time of COVID. Really appreciate your both your taking time and for your patience in us changing the timings over the last week. I really thank you for your patience, and thank you
Thank
for
you,
joining
Firoz.
us.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Okay, you go well,
Yeah.
keep safe, and keep that hope sheltered. Okay. That was Ashish Kothari speaking to us about radical pathways out of the current global crisis. This is Firoz Manchi from the Raja Press, signing off from Organizing in the Time of COVID. Tomorrow we will be speaking early morning in our time, but tomorrow we'll be speaking. The first thing will be two comrades from China about the organizing that has been happening there and the challenges that they face today. So please join me tomorrow for discussions about organizing in the time of COVID-19 uh, in China. This is Firoz Manji. Thanks, and look after yourselves. And we will be back online tomorrow.